for dealing with it. I'm just gonna do sort of an overview of what we went through in the first class, because some of you weren't here and the rest of you probably didn't memorize it. And today we're going to talk about, is secularism enough? Is it sufficient as a worldview? And these yearnings for transcendence, where they exist. And then next week we're going to talk about the amazing number of choices that we have. How do you deal with that? And the issue of doubt. And finally, how do we merge our spiritual and secular points of view? 3 strategies for dealing with it, and which one do you choose? And so let's go over, we'll start with the prayer that we had last week, if you don't mind reading with me. From the
cowardice that dares not face new truth, from the laziness that is contented with half-truth, from the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth, good Lord, deliver me.
Which we are calling this the congressional prayer now, right? So here's the key question that Charles Taylor asked, and it's the thing that drives this whole understanding of how we got to where we are, and that is, why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God in, say, 1500? Everybody naively just assumed God exists. It's not something you had to think through or decide. It was imposed on you. It was given to you. While in the year 2000, many of us find this not only easy, it's easy not to believe, but even inescapable. And then David Brooks, in the essay that I've said over there, has put it in a slightly different way. How did we move from the all-encompassing sacred cosmos? And he's talking about, whereas we talk about the universe or the world, back then everything is suffused with God. So it's the sacred cosmos, our current world, in which faith is a choice, in which some people believe, others don't, and a lot of us are in the middle. And as I told you last week, the world in 1500, and I'm just going to run through how we got to where we are. Then we are immersed like fish in a great aquarium with God in the year 1500. It's all around us. God is not just up in the sky. He's every institution around us, from our local church. The pastor has been selected by God. The king is there by divine authority. And the church leaders are there because God put them there. So everything around us has been ordered and is the way it's supposed to be. And then finally, this idea of enchantment, which is, and again, enchantment sounds like a positive thing. It means that everything around us is filled with demons and spiritual figures, and that they can actually go through us, they can possess us, and we're constantly fighting off these evil and also positive forces. This is a depiction from that time where someone's trying to draw what it looked like to live in this era. This is St. Anthony, who's dealing with temptation, and temptation is seen as, these are literal figures. One person pointed out last week that I had Hieronymus Bosch posted that he was actually making fun of this sort of thing, satirizing it. He is, but it's actually, he is depicting the world as people saw it, and then making fun of this world. For people coming in, there's a book list that I set over there if you want to see it, and there's also David Brooks' article that you can read if I can start to bore you. And what happens is around 1400, there emerges Christian reforms, and this is actually how we get to secularization. It's, for many people, they thought it was science comes along, people start thinking scientifically, and religion gets pushed aside. But actually, the whole process starts with a lot of things that we're familiar with, because Luther is one of the ones pushing these things. He's pushing an attack on folk religion and indulgences. It's not just indulgences, it's the idea that you could go, and if you're having problems, you go and light a candle and you put it in the church. Or if you're hurt, you go and you get a relic, and that helps you with the injury. Or, any number of things that you do to fight off and ward off all of these evil things around you. Or if you want to have, good agriculture this year, you go out and do certain things. So there's also the priesthood of believers, where in that society, as I told you last week, if you ask somebody in 1500, are you religious? Most people would say no, because religious was the leaders, the people at the monastery and the convent. they are religious, even though everybody's surrounded by this, they were thought as being the religious ones, and they represent the community. Well, this ends up changing because of Luther and the other people, and everyone ends up adopting and starting to believe and act like the leadership of the church. So there's a flattening of the society. Instead of being like this, it ends up moving horizontal. Sola Scriptura, we become responsible for our own beliefs. We start reading the Bible on our own, and it becomes a much more rational faith. And finally, glory to God alone, that God is radically different from who we are, okay? This is a concept. With Thomas Aquinas, for instance, when he came up with his ideas about justifications for how we know God exists, he wasn't trying to prove to somebody in the year 1200 that God exists. Everybody knew it existed. He was actually just working out the process to show that God existed and how logical it was to everybody. So what Luther did is he undercuts this notion, and eventually we get to the idea of Kierkegaard and his idea of, that we have a leap of faith because God is so different from us. God has to come, and he comes to us. It's not something that's natural. And as a result of all of these things, there are unintended consequences. Even though Luther and Zwingli and all of those guys are focused on these things with the church, there are three impacts as a result of these reforms. The first one is God is pushed up and out. He's not immanent anymore. He's not all around us. He ends up being pushed out there. He becomes transcendent, but no longer immanent. The second thing is that authorities are shot down, that the authority of the church is undercut, the authority of kings is undercut, and people are able to start making choices. You choose now who your king is or who your leader is. It's no longer a thing that's instituted and given. And then the third one is the world came to be seen as orderly, and there's not just all these spirits and demons all around us. The term we use for that is disenchanted world. The world became disenchanted. It's no longer that way. And there's a great deal of interest in re-enchantment, and we'll talk about that some in just a few minutes. And you see that everywhere from, last night I saw that there's a new TV series on Dracula. And someone mentioned, what movies did we mention last time? We mentioned Harry Potter, right, and the werewolf phenomenon. Everyone wants to re-enchant the world and bring all these spirits and these crazy sort of things back around us. The next thing is the buffered self, and this is a weird concept for us to understand how different it was in the year 1500. And that is, they had an idea that was called a porous self, which is that spiritual things could go right through you, take control of you. You didn't have control of yourself. And a number of people said as a result of these reforms, plus the emergence of science, we've developed a buffered selves. So we're self-contained, we control ourselves. If there's a problem, we usually look inside ourselves. We can actually make ourselves better. We can go eat better and do all of these things. We're not a passive figure anymore, the way they were in the 1500s. And then the immanent frame, which we'll talk about again. This is basically looking at the world through secular eyes. Not, when your car breaks down, you don't head to church and light a candle to try to get it fixed. You don't turn and you call Satan for what's going on. You call a mechanic, okay? You deal with what's right there in front of you, okay?
Even though you might call Jesus' name first.
You probably will. I don't know how spiritual that is. I was thinking about that just in so many ways. When you have different things going on, you could actually have a spiritual framework on it. And it would be crazy, but if you start to think about, and I mentioned some of the things, the weather's going, when you want to know what the weather's like, you used to pray and the whole community would come together and try to do something to make sure the weather would change. Now, we listen to John Milan, and, he's right about, 50% of the time? So, I don't know how that compares to the Middle Ages, but the Nova effect is, as a result of all of these things, the authorities are being turned over, and the world becomes disenchanted. Our religious faith, instead of diminishing, there was a lot of talk that as things became more secular, that the world become less religious. Well, obviously that has not happened. In fact, instead, it's increased the amount of diversity out there. So it's like a Noah, boom, it goes in a lot of different directions. In fact, it keeps on going and going and going. Maybe the best way to think of it is as a cell that keeps on splitting. That when, and I'll mention this in just a second, it's just amazing to me how adaptable Christianity is, okay? And it starts actually early on when you're dealing with the pagan mindset. How much of that stuff do you adopt? How much of Plato do you adopt? How much of Aristotle do you adopt? Well, you adopt some of it, you move on. Sometimes you reject some of those things. Sometimes you respond to the larger culture and reject it. But you're actually adapting and accommodating with the larger culture throughout. And then a term we'll talk about next week in greater detail, it's expressive individualism, where we start to see everything in terms of whether it's good or bad for me, and not necessarily in a selfish way, but you make decisions about what church you go to. Is it good to me? It's not a given to you. You don't just belong to the parish where you're born. And you think about just about everything. It doesn't have to be religious, but you think about it in terms of are you happy? I mean, look at any sort of advertising, and is this fulfilling to you? And let's talk now about the eminent frame. Have you seen these glasses? This is the Google glass. Have you seen how it works? It's like having, when you look, everything's okay, but then you have like a Google screen right here, and you can talk out to it and say, take a picture of this scene, and it'll take a picture of what's in front of you. It's interesting but creepy. So, the eminent frame, the 4 points I told you, cosmos should be understood on its own terms. If you're talking about a car that broke down, you worry about the car that's right in front of you, and you deal with the mechanics of the car. If you're dealing with economics, you deal with the economy. You can bring in some of the other things, but you're focused mainly on that topic. Reality is considered orderly and causal. One thing leads to another. There's a process by which things have happened. Third, science is a principal tool for obtaining facts, and as I told you, Houston Smith likes to refer to the fact that we are fact fundamentalists. I'm in a book club, small book club, and we were reading Emily Dickinson just recently, and I asked the group, who here has read a book of poetry in the last 5 years? And these are highly intelligent people, not a one of them had read it. It's just not something we do. We focus on facts, and we want to know, actually my daughter in her theology class this year, which she's battling with because I've told her too much stuff, I think. She was like, why can't religion be more like math? And I was like, oh no, I've really failed. And then knowledge is divided into numerous disciplines, whereas everything was coherent before. Now you divide everything up into all sorts of categories. The main thing to think about this when you're thinking about the eminent frame, and I call it the secular viewpoint last point, the eminent frame is basically you are not assuming that God exists. You're not saying he does exist, but when you're dealing with this particular topic, when you're fixing your car and you're looking at the engine, it's not relevant to you in the eminent frame whether God exists or not. It's just not an issue. And we do this with all sorts of things. When I'm doing a story and I'm interviewing someone, and I'm thinking about what issues am I going to do with who, what, when, where, why. Are you doing it? Do I believe you? Is this BS? I'm not thinking at that point. I'm thinking in terms of an eminent frame. And actually, newspapers, if you think about it, the newspaper is they're largely the application of the eminent frame to the daily events of our lives. Okay, and you don't see. You used to see, and there's some stories from. If you look at stories of 1850s, 1840s. You would see references to when an accident happened that perhaps God saved the people because more people weren't injured or something like that. There's the eminent frame, but there's also the spiritual frame, and the two are combined when they're doing the stories. But now today it's all told from the eminent frame, and God is referred to usually in only one general circumstance, and that is personal morality. when you're talking about the issue of abortion or homosexuality or something like that, the reporters occasionally feel the need to call a ministry. And you'll see this application, the eminent frame, not just in those particular instances. I'm gonna point out three recent stories to you, in which, see, thinking of things in terms of the eminent frame and spiritual frame help you understand the topic. This is a local story that became a national story. And this is the Newman family. Their daughter had diabetes, and instead of doing like what we would do when you have diabetes, we think in terms of eminent frame, go to a doctor, you go to a hospital, you try to deal with those circumstances. They thought of it in exclusively spiritual terms, and they thought this is a result of something, and God is the only solution, and our response will be to pray about it. And the state has to figure out what should it do in these circumstances, and obviously the parents ended up getting charged criminally they got charged with homicide for not taking her to the hospital. This isn't a rare situation. This is where almost all of us would agree. I assume all of us would agree in here. But you know, you have Christian scientists, and we even had a governor who was a Christian scientist. I don't know if you know that, who would, I remember he hurt his leg, Scott McCallum did, and we had this issue of, are you gonna get treatment for that or not? So that's one story. This next story is probably one you're not familiar with. It's actually kind of a sad story. This is the story of, and I'll butcher his name, Arenda Kolar, and he was a doctor. He decided to make it his life's work to disenchant the world of India. He would go around, and when people were doing things that they said, we are really, if a holy man had electrified the public with his miracles, Dr. Kolar, a former physician, would duplicate the miracles and explain step by step how they were performed. The sorcerer had amassed a fortune treating infertility. He would arrange a sting operation to unmask the man as a fraud. His goal was to drive a scientist's skepticism into the heart of India, a country still teeming with gurus, babas, astrologers, godmen, and other mystical entrepreneurs. He was killed. Someone who objected to what he was doing, two people killed him. And the funny thing was, the local police over the last month have been very reluctant to prosecute the two people because they're concerned that there'll be a backlash from a number of the people who still believe in this enchanted world. So it's not, I've been talking primarily about the West, America and Europe, but in places like this disenchanting process is actually going on today, and there are real world consequences. People see things the way they see them, and they want them to remain this way. And you understand why he wants to do what he's doing, but it's actually interesting to see the process. I mentioned to you the Thomas Pynchon book, where he's laying down the Mason-Dixon line, and as he goes through, the magic all disappears, and the world is disenchanted. So this is one, and then a third story. This is a story that appeared in the Journal Sentinel. This is a Dallas surgeon who is a very religious guy, and he's decided that he's going to start praying with everybody he treats. And because he believes that medicine has been too dry and it doesn't deal with some of the spiritual issues people have. And it's interesting because a lot of the people, especially in Dallas, want that. But he's now sort of stepped that up a bit, where he's now offering to evangelize, and if you would wish to convert, while you're being treated by him, he'll go through the process and do that for you. I mean, he'll evangelize, tell you the stories and stuff like that. So some people have started to object to the fact that there's a power relationship here, and he's in a superior position, and you're in a vulnerable position, but he feels very strongly that he wants to make sure people know who Jesus Christ is before they die. So you have this situation where we're used to people having an imminent frame in dealing with health issues. And many of you know my wife had leukemia, and she was in her first week there. This desire to help people address their other needs was there, and we had an Indian doctor who came in and said, we know she's not doing well, and offered to read a poem to her. And so he says, this is a romantic poet. That doesn't mean he loves a lot of people. And it's like, oh God. So Art Manley Hopkins, he reads the poem, and I didn't even think Sonia heard it. And then she told me later, if we pay anything to that guy, so I had to go through and see that he billed $380 to read us the poem. I had to challenge that. That fee, but it's the thing where we're used to an imminent frame, but this is a guy who's building a spiritual frame on top of it and trying to apply it. And many of us, I would be uncomfortable. I'd be terribly uncomfortable if I'm being treated by this doctor, and he says to me, "If you were to die today, would you go to heaven?" And I would be like, "I'm really not hoping to die today." But he's an incredibly popular person, but people file complaints against him, and so the issue is, should you be able to do this or not? And there are two other major areas where you see this, and it's not just on a particular topic. First is American politics. When I taught the class on same-sex marriage several years ago, when we had the amendment going through, it was interesting watching your guys' responses to it, your perspectives on it, because there were some people who were saying, okay, this is a political issue, but they would say that God made one man and one woman, they're supposed to. So the belief was, even though this is a political subject, I can bring my spiritual perspective to this and argue against it. Argue in favor of this position. Then there were other people who were saying, I don't think we should bring God into this. This is a subject, this is politics, separation of church and state. So those are people who are saying that this is an imminent frame, that this is the only way we should see this thing. And then it became a little bit more confusing because the supporters of same-sex marriage decided to set up a website and use biblical passages to justify their perspective. So they were coming to they were using the same spiritual lens to deal with the situation, yet they were coming to a different conclusion. And when I was showing all this stuff, it was interesting where people were trying to figure out, so which frame do we use? And it's not just that. There are any number of situations. Anytime someone gets involved and brings God into the conversation, there are other people who say, well, you shouldn't, because of separation of church and state. But you've got it on both sides. You've got the religious right that's done it, but you've also got civil rights leaders who brought the church in, and people who still bring it in. Micah is all about taking a spiritual frame and applying it to politics. That's one area. Another area is religion, not just American religion. And the comic says, "You're weak and spineless and wishy-washy. She really took you apart, didn't she, Charlie Brown? Yeah, step by step, verse by verse, and line by line. You sound like a victim of higher criticism." Well, in the 1800s, what people did was they applied the imminent frame to science, to technology, to weather, to the military science, agriculture science, all of these other subjects. In the 1800s, people decided we're going to apply it to the Bible, and we're going to apply it to church history. And the results were, they were difficult for a lot of people. For instance, it became pretty clear by taking the imminent frame and applying it to the Bible that Moses didn't write the 5 books of Moses. They might have his name, but they weren't his. It's clear if you read the book of Genesis and you split it up and you treat it just like another work of art, another book, you'll see multiple authors, and that there was an editor who put all of these things together. You'll also see that the Gospels used a number of sources when they were putting these things together. That Matthew and Luke had another document that we don't have anymore, that they were relying on, adapting and rewriting to put together their Gospels. And we found out that Paul probably didn't write all of the letters that Paul supposedly wrote. Okay, so a book like 1st and 2nd Timothy, which I mentioned to you last week. And I should tell you, in December, I'm going to teach a class, 6 principles for understanding the Bible, the tough passages of the Bible. And I talked to you last week about the passage in 2nd Timothy that says that women are supposed to wear pearls, gold, and their salvation comes through their childbearing, which is stunning to people when you tell them, well, actually, but Paul didn't write that. There's another guy in the name of Paul, who probably a few years after him is trying to apply Pauline principles to that situation of the church. But these things happen, and they also start to realize that there's an argument that the historical Jesus isn't the same person who's the biblical Jesus, okay? So what do we do with that? Some people, fundamentalists and conservative Christians, reject it wholesale and say you should never apply the eminent frame to the Bible, okay? Or to church history or any of that sort of stuff. There are some people, particularly seculars, who say this is the only frame you should apply to it, and it undercuts it all. But then there's also people who say bring it on and accommodate their faith and accept some of it, reject some of it. And as I said, the church has been very, very flexible and has been able to adapt to these sorts of changes. And you know, I use a lot of these classes to tell you what's going on in historical and biblical research, because you know, it's interesting stuff, and it doesn't mean that what you believe is wrong. It just means you should be aware of these things. Okay, so the eminent frame has been applied even to all of these matters of our faith. I hate the word takeaways, but I couldn't figure out another word. It's like too much of a cliche these days. But these are the three points that I take away from just this general discussion, and then we'll be done with what we discussed last week. The first one is the widespread use of the eminent frame has led to advances in such subjects as science, medicine, and technology. We all know this. The changes have been dramatic, amazing. I mean, from minor things to you know, in medicine, to the fact that we're doing a PowerPoint presentation like this that's incredible. Louis C.K. tells this thing about where he's in an airplane and he can't get the Wi-Fi to work, and he's yelling at the flight attendant, and then he realizes, I'm flying 30,000 feet in the air and I've got Wi-Fi. And it's just, you know, there are all sorts of things that are amazing. The eminent frame has also brought some very bad things. I mean, we have now some terribly, you know, nuclear bombs, any number of other things. The eminent frame and the scientific approach tells us what can be done. It doesn't tell us what should be done. So, I mean, that's an important distinction that we should make during this. But the advances have been incredible. The widespread use of the eminent frame has not destroyed religious faith as expected. As I told you, if in 1960 you gathered a group of sociologists and asked them, do you expect a decline of religion over the next 50 years? Some people would have said that religion would be gone within 50 years. But instead, they had this perspective of a zero-sum game. Do you know what a zero-sum game is? If somebody gains something, the other side loses. It's like a cake. If I take a bigger slice, you get a smaller slice, okay? And the assumption was, as secularism grew, spirituality would diminish. But that hasn't happened at all. In fact, as secularism has grown, spirituality has grown just along with it. And then finally, Christianity and other religions have an incredible ability to adapt to change. As I said repeatedly, even with adaptations, Jason taught a class on evolutionary theory. There are some who accept evolutionary theory in the church, some who don't, but the church is adapted so that you have options. again, anytime there's a new thing that comes in, it creates options within the church. There are groups that are going to reject it, some groups that are going to say, this should replace what we believe, and some people who end up accommodating it. This isn't always a good thing. And, there's the case of, eugenics in the church in the early 1900s, where the liberal church, the mainline church, the Methodists, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians went along with eugenics. It was science, so we all agreed with it. Okay, it turned out to be a very horrible thing. And I'm going to teach a class on how we don't really learn things from history. And there are three things that I think we should learn theologically from our history. One, that the Civil War taught us that a strict verse-by-verse literal reading of the Bible is a very dangerous thing. People who read the Bible very literally says slavery is okay. They accept this, and it allowed them to perpetuate an institution that was very harmful to a lot of people. Two, the eugenics controversy. Just a blind acceptance of science led the church and mainline church to promote eugenics at the turn of the century. And then the last one, which I did touch on last year, and that is the Holocaust. And what the Holocaust has taught us, that supersessionism, the belief that Christianity replaces Judaism, Judaism is now no longer important. That sort of theology was a necessary but not a sufficient reason for the Holocaust. It became a part of the justification for the extermination of Jews. Those are three things, and I'll get to it later. The Civil War one, I'd like to teach it in the spring, just to go through and explain how the Civil War, along with other things, was a theological controversy and dispute. Do you guys follow what I'm saying in this? So the issue is, do we need a spiritual frame? The immanent frame has been highly successful, and we've gained a lot of things as a result of it. Our lifestyles changed dramatically. You know, in the 1200s, just to think about how different things were, there was a church council, and there were several church councils that encouraged people. Here it is. In the 12th century, in the Middle Ages, there were statements in the Lateran Council and other church councils warning the clergy against use of ordinary medicine instead of spiritual remedies, such as relics, the Eucharistic host, and other things. So it wasn't just that they didn't use medicine; it was actively discouraged, and there was strong warnings against going to infidel doctors, which of course would be Jewish doctors. So I mean, we've moved to a situation where the church is actively encouraging people not to seek out medical attention, to now where the average life expectancy is what, 80 or so? I mean, it's dramatic. So do we need a spiritual, do we need a frame in addition to the immanent frame? And the fact is, many of us find that there are incidents in our lives and experiences that we have that aren't adequately represented and understood through the immanent frame. People have come up with different names for these things, these different spiritual experiences. And a guy named William James wrote the first book, and very important, you don't have to remember all these details, but he wrote a book called Varieties of Religious Experience. He just went out and started documenting in America, in Africa, in Asia, experiences that people had that they can understand and explain only in spiritual terms. A guy named Rudolf Otto used the term ineffable, which just means it's something you can't explain. It's something that immanent frame of science, the causal nature, facts, it's just impossible to explain within that concept. And James focused primarily on individual experiences. Rudolf Otto talks about the numinous, and that's still personal experiences, but whereas William James focused on mainly positive experiences, Otto said sometimes these things can be terrifying experiences that we are unable to explain. And most of us, again, through many of these yearnings for transcendence that I talked about, are aware of them. They could be something like, the most obvious one is when confronted with death. I mean, that's not a positive experience. It's an overwhelming, incredible experience. And it is funny, it is interesting to me that some of the most secular people I know, when you go to a funeral, that they shift into this spiritual frame and start discussing. It's always vague and general, but but people are uncomfortable with talking about death in just imminent terms. Richard Swinburne talks about a principle of credulity, and that is, and I'm not trying to overwhelm you with this, but there are just different ways of thinking about these experiences. He starts talking about communal acts, and if you think about the Middle Ages, or even now in the Orthodox Church, the experience of the divine comes in the liturgy. We together are going to create something bigger than ourselves through this service, and that's a very important part of the Orthodox theology. It's something you feel when you're part of a large group. You feel like something bigger than me is going on. And he points out, even if it's an individual thing, similar people can see the same thing from different perspectives. A beautiful sunrise, what means to someone in the imminent frame, a beautiful sunrise, whereas someone from a spiritual perspective sees it as God's handiwork. So which is it? Well, it's both. I mean, to the one it's the one thing, and to the other it's another. And Charles Taylor uses the term fullness, and he says that sometimes we have these things that are so rich and so big that they make us feel like we're beyond what we're normally doing. Do you guys understand this? And on the other side, there's alienation. Most of us live in between those two things all the time, but there are these rare occurrences where we can only understand aspects of our lives through a spiritual frame. Okay? Do you understand what I'm saying by this thing? I mean, it's a little bit different, but you actually see it sometimes in things that are not specifically religious. And you see these desires to reach things, the transcendent, things bigger than yourself all the time. We spend a lot of our time trying to have these experiences, these grand experiences that can't be explained simply through facts and all those things. One, obviously, celebrity worship. I mean, we have American Idol, obviously, and another one would be movies and film. We talked about those different things that are where we have magical things going on, things that are beyond the scientific and so forth. We also have brand identity, which might be a little confusing. We're running late, so I won't run it. But I was hoping Chris would be here for the opening of an Apple store in London. And the BBC reporter goes around and starts talking about how the people look like they're members of a cult. And they're doing all these weird things together in the crowd. And then and he says, oh, they all have these weird looks in their eyes. And then they're willing to do anything to get these products, etc. So, and actually, if you look up the word if you look up the words on Google, Steve Jobs and Messiah, you'll get 100,000 hits. Okay, there are national stories about it that he was the Messiah for the industry. Also, rock concerts. I go to a lot of concerts. I go to about 20 to 40 a year. I went to one Friday night, and it's funny, just the feeling. People really love that feeling of being part of a group and this grand experience. And I don't know, I was thinking about it during the concert. It was supposed to sit in your seat, and you got a assigned seat. The singer was someone named Nico Case. And toward the end of the concert, there were like 100 kids, college kids, who came rushing to the stage and started dancing. So they were just sort of overwhelmed, and they felt this need to experience it. It's you know. Backers. And then obviously, did you love it? Well, I mean, obviously, for us, that's the most obvious one. There are holy days, sacred grounds, shrines and pilgrimages. If you want to go to the Hall of Fame, you can. There are rituals. You see Saint Vince everywhere. And obviously saints. But it is true, it's not just this. Think about American politics. Just back up for a second. American life. Holy days, July 4th. Sacred grounds, you go to the Washington Monument or something like that, the Lincoln Memorial. Shrines and pilgrimages, you take the trip, you take the kids, this is the big thing, we're going to go see it. You need to see what Gettysburg's like. Okay, you're going to be bored, but no, this isn't important. you have rituals, you start off the school day, and you have certain figures. I mean, whether it's Martin Luther King Day or whether it's Lincoln. And in fact, Robert Bella, a famous sociologist, talks about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit of American politics. The father being George Washington, the son being Abraham Lincoln, and Robert Kennedy being the Holy Spirit, though not particularly a very good Holy Spirit in terms of his personal life. But you know, it's just a way to think about what he called public belief. So Charles Taylor says, with all these things going on, what does it mean for our faith today? What does it mean for people who do decide to adopt a spiritual frame? Okay? Our belief system is going to be different than the belief system has ever been before. Okay? It's not going to be anything like in the Middle Ages. It's not going to be like what it was in the 1700s or even the 1900s. First, it's going to be more mental. We're actually thinking through what we believe. We're constructing it ourselves. It's not naive. It's not imposed on us. It's not, we're not told what to believe. Maybe we are told what to believe, but then we leave. We decide not to do that. I grew up in a hardcore fundamentalist family. I was told what to believe and what verses to believe and what was important, and I decided, I'm checking out. Okay? You can make that decision. It's more personal. It's important what's going on with me. It's not important what's going on just with the community. I'm making the decisions, what's worthwhile and what's meaningful to me. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something you should be aware of. That's how we're making decisions today. And then finally, it's more voluntary. You can decide every Sunday whether you can sleep in, go to Starbucks, or come to Sunday school. It's something you're choosing to do. You're making a choice. The hard thing is about the choices is when I told you about the Nova effect. Religion has become so, you have so many choices. We're winding down with this class, but next week we're going to talk about how do you deal with all of those choices? How do you make a decision as to what you're going to do? The Germans have a phrase for it. I don't speak German. Does anyone here speak German? You want to? It's called, and it means the agony of choice. That you have so many choices that it becomes a burden to deal with the choices. So the two things that we're going to do next week that I want to finish with is to deal with, in a secular world, we have increased choice. That also means increased doubt, because as long as we know we're making a choice, that means we might not be making another choice. Someone else makes a choice. Is that a good choice? Did they make a better choice? I mean, we're having to choose between what faith we're going to have and which one we're not going to have, or whether we're not going to have one altogether. And then the second one is, if you do make a choice to have faith, how do you combine that? When do you decide to adopt the immanent frame, and when do you decide to adopt the spiritual frame? So, as I told you last week, we got like 2 minutes. So last week when I ended, people were like, I have these ideas about the whole thing. Does anybody have anything that they want to say in response to what we've been talking about today? Do you follow it? Do you follow most of this? I'm not trying to overwhelm you with this stuff. I'm trying to, as I say, give you tools for understanding contemporary society and how you're dealing with things, and to help you evaluate how other people are making choices. When you do have a political debate, when is it important? When do I think I should apply this frame or not this frame? And when we're talking about when we have a religious dispute between conservatives and liberals, almost every one of those disputes have to do with whether we apply the immanent frame or not to the Bible, to the church, to any one of these things.
We started class last week with the fact that we're on this historical journey towards secularism, and yet there is a part of the world that's still very spiritual in nature, and I don't know how you break that down by geography or ethnic band or socioeconomic status, that still live with a lot of difficulties in their life and a lot of religious faith to deal with that.
Sure.
Do you view that historic trend just continuing? I mean, the biggest issue of our day supposedly is Western secularism against some very violent groups that are faith-based.
Which is the interplay. I mean, what you're seeing is two different perspectives. perspectives colliding into each other.
So is that something we'll take care of it because we're all still on that path?
I think first we need to be humble about these things, because every time someone says secularism is going to do this, it doesn't always happen. And it's going to be, there were a group called positivists, who were very positive about what the eminent frame would bring about. And, you know, one thing that happened as a result of the eminent frame is because authorities were removed and God was no longer the one deciding what happened in society, people started deciding, we need to decide how to create a perfect society. So you end up having communists, socialists, dictators, and other people creating what they thought were perfect societies and murdering large numbers of people as a result of this. What I'm talking about primarily is what's called the northern phenomenon, North America, Canada, and Europe. But even within those contexts, secularism in America is different than secularism in France, and it's different than secularism in India. There are little differences because secularism grows up in a historical perspective. And in England, you still have an established church. Here you don't. And so their understanding of how secularism works and how it interacts with the spiritual frame is different there than it is here. So I don't know, and I have no way of predicting how this will turn out, but I think you do see the Western influence in places like India with the story that I pointed out to you of the doctor who's decided to go and try to, on his own, reform the society. The only thing is, there are consequences for that sort of thing, because people are invested in the spiritual frame.
I really appreciate your gift at explaining and teaching this. Where I challenge you is I hear so much dualism, which is an ancient concept. There's the Richard Rohrs who say that's a big problem. You split and turn things into saint and sinner.
Right.
When it's a hodgepodge of both, and to live in that midst of not trying to say right and wrong, you know.
Actually, you know,
Are you gonna do something on common ground where we're all can kind of stand
well,
together?
that's what I was talking about. And some of these things, many of the religious debates, you have someone using the spiritual frame, and they're picking up the spiritual frame and saying, this is the only way you can see this. The fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, other fundamentalists. And then you have people on the other side, the scientists, the secularists, the Richard Dawkins of the world, picking up the eminent frame and saying, this is the only way to see it. But most of us aren't in those camps.
Can you help bring us together?
I just said, I said week 3 was all about how do we put the two things together. I'm not gonna do it. I'm not gonna do it. What I'm gonna do is say, here's some options, you choose. So you have to do it. I'm sorry, but that's the way it works now. You don't have people telling you this is the way it's gonna be.
Yeah,
You
but
have to
But
choose.
it ain't about me to a certain extent. You know what I'm saying? That's the center of the universe. And there's a weakness there. And
The thing is, though, that we are and we continue to move from a society that was highly authoritarian. And we can choose to put ourselves in an authoritarian context.
I agree, but I didn't choose to be born.
You didn't choose to be born, but the best man at my wedding decided, he was a Southern Baptist, decided that he wanted to become Greek Orthodox and a monk, and he's now at Mount Athos, in an incredibly authoritarian system. But he chose to be in that system. You can choose to be in a sort of system like that,
Jesus means free.
where someone else makes a lot of decisions for you. And, you know, in any situation we're in, we're in contexts where other people are recommending solutions and telling us how to think about it. I am telling you about one perspective on the secularization process. It's the most, you know, it's the most interesting one out there. It's relatively new. It's had a widespread impact on a number of different disciplines, but no, I'm not gonna tell you what to think next week. I'm just gonna give you a few options and let you try to figure it out.
Split into groups.
One final question. Could it be part of the kind of, the human pathos? Because even within science, I mean, there's a great line in A Beautiful Mind where John Nash says, you know, Adam Smith wasn't wrong, he was incomplete. Gentlemen, he was incomplete. So at a time when Einstein came, it was heresy to question Newton. And then recently there was a postdoc at Cambridge named Armijo or something who wrote a book called Faster Than the Speed of Light. And everybody cautioned him. They said, you published this, your career is over. It's heresy to question Einstein. So even within the scientific community, they got their mindset on something, and sometimes it takes
Well,
someone.
that's Thomas Kuhn's ideas about paradigms and how it works, that you have, are you guys familiar with Thomas Kuhn? The Nature of Scientific Revolutions, that you have a paradigm that everybody pretty much agrees to, whether it's the Copernican perspective on how things work, and then there are cracks in the system, and then there's a few radicals who say this isn't really working, and then boom, the whole thing collides, and a new paradigm emerges. And that's how science works. It's not just a straight linear progress, it's more like loops going along. Sometimes you're moving forward, sometimes you're not, and you have these paradigms that are there, collapse, reemerge, collapse, reemerge. What quantum physics would be the new paradigm that's going on right now, but it's not in 100 years, that's not gonna be the main paradigm. So what you're talking about is very similar to what Thomas Kuhn, actually I think it's the 50th anniversary of the Nature of Scientific Revolutions. So again, next week, that's what we're talking about. Tao, the options that you have and how you accommodate these things together. And then, as I told you, in December, I was going to teach a class on sex in the Bible, which I was just doing that to get numbers. But, but I've been asked repeatedly to do one on the Bible and how you deal with. There was a women's group here who was having a hard time dealing with genocide in the Old Testament and other issues in the New Testament. So I'm going to actually take the class that I teach to the confirmation kids, to your kids, and I'm going to teach it here so you can see, my principles and how I approach the Bible and how I deal with those difficult passages. We'll do that. I think it's the first or second week in December. So thanks for coming. See you next week.